Welcome to the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinscoe. I'm an advisor, author, and general explorer of the service and experience space. My guests tend to have just released some interesting research. They run a company that has some interesting tech in the service and experience space. They are part of an organization that is doing some cool stuff, or they run their own business doing interesting things for both their customers and or their employees. That's enough for me. Let's get into the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have Juliette Powell and Art Kleiner. Hi, Juliette. Hi, Art. How are you doing?
Great. How are you?
I am splendid. And Art, yourself?
Terrific. Really glad to be here.
Super. So Juliette and then Art, perhaps, maybe for the benefit of our listeners and readers that read the highlights, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the work that you do?
Sure, I'll start.
Sure.
I am lucky to be the co-author of a brand new book called The AI Dilemma, 7 Principles of Responsible Technology. I am someone who is always curious about the world, the lifetime learner. I have the pleasure of teaching at NYU at the Interactive Telecommunications department. And I grew up in Canada and the US simultaneously. I'm bilingual, English and French. I have dual citizenship. Some would say I'm bi in many ways.
Perfect. And Art, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a long-time advisor, writer, interested in technology, and behind every technology story, there's a business story, and behind every business story, there's a culture story. So when Juliette showed me her dissertation at Columbia, and I said, there's a book here, she said, would you like to help me write it? And there we are. And so we ended up as co-authors. So I'm, in many ways, I'm also very lucky to be here.
Awesome. Now, as Juliette mentioned, and Art, you can mention too, you've both co-authored, just written a new book called The AI Dilemma, 7 Principles for Responsible Technology. Now, Juliette, given it started with your thesis, your dissertation sort of thing, maybe you can take the reins on this one and tell me a little bit about it, how it came about, who's it for, and what's its main thesis before we dig into some of the details.
Sure. Well, the main thesis, I think we're all living it. All of us who have access to the internet and digital technology, essentially, we have been more and more. We've had the ability to really use artificial intelligence for the first time in many cases. Many people didn't realize that they were using AI. And with the launch of generative AI, I think that more and more people are exploring in ways that they never could have before. So that's very, very exciting to me. And at the same time, it's at the heart of the dilemma itself. In the right hands, it is beneficial to all of us, everyone on the planet. Mm-hmm. In the right hands, it could cause some serious harms. And we've already seen so many lawsuits coming out around OpenAI. I think that's just the beginning, not just in terms of generative AI. We're going to be seeing lawsuits across the board. I think when it comes to just AI in general and the way that it's treating certain groups of people versus others. Mm-hmm. And so that's a big concern of mine. I was lucky enough to work with Intel Labs to map the personal data ecosystem on a global level. That was back in 2012. And the thesis there was that if the majority of people in the world didn't have access to infrastructure as well as digital tools, data literacy, and that they would need to also have trust in the overall ecosystem. If these things didn't happen simultaneously, then most likely data and AI would be more beneficial to certain groups than others. And sure enough, that's what we're seeing now.
Awesome. Now, obviously, we want people to kind of buy the book. Kind of one of the reasons that you're here to promote the book. But in order to do that, I think it'd be useful if we can dig in a little bit. And if I could ask you a few questions about some of the things that stood out in the book to me to give people a flavor of the book. So Art, I'd like to come to you if I may and ask you about, data privacy and security are big issues, particularly in the experience space that I look at. And in the book, you talk about 4 challenges that we face to regain control of personal data. I mean, can you kind of quickly, briefly highlight or explain what they are?
Well, Adrian, as Juliette says, we are our personal data. That's the thing that people see first. They see that before they see our body language, before we show up in person. We look up each other and we know more about each other than we arguably ever have before. Mm-hmm. And that's because what we do online and how we introduce ourselves has already been taken and circulated by the companies that manage the websites that we use and run other experience. So, the 4 kind of challenges which came out of the work that Juliette just mentioned and other work that she did are digital trust. Do people really believe that their data is going to be held with the same respect we would give it ourselves? Mm-hmm. Digital infrastructure, do we have the wherewithal? Do we have the electricity and the internet to manage it? Digital access, are some groups able to control their data more than other groups? And then data literacy, which is, do we have the wisdom and knowledge, the technical knowledge and the human knowledge? Mm-hmm. Use it responsibly? And that's actually where experience comes in. If I am going to own my personal data, which would be great, mm-hmm. I would love to have control over who uses what, when they use it. If they're making money, I'd love to have some of it come back to me. If that's going to happen, we need a user experience, a human experience, a designed experience that makes it not just possible for me to do that, but easy to do it and to understand the real issues involved. A translation of those 2 lines of fine print that you get when you click OK. I want to run it. I want to manage it. I want the experience of doing it.
Awesome. Yeah, no, those are big things. I mean, I was just talking to somebody earlier and we were talking about how you talk about access and infrastructure, and then you also talk about literacy. And it made me think about, I was talking to somebody earlier on today and we were talking about similar sort of stuff and how I thought, well, actually access to the internet, whether that's through fiber or fixed lines or kind of satellite or whatever, I mean, in many ways it's becoming, or it feels like it should become a public good, that everybody should have access to it. Then you kind of democratize that, or kind of, you give, it makes it that you don't actually necessarily, it shouldn't be a kind of a pay to play sort of thing. It should be just a kind of a fundamental right in many ways. And so that's a big kind of challenge to figure out kind of how we can do that. But the other thing that also kind of struck me in the book, and maybe I can come to you, Juliette, on this one, is this that in the book you talk about that open the closed box, and they talked about making AI explainable in a way that makes sense to each type of stakeholder and be open about what you can and what you cannot reveal. I mean, particularly in this idea or around this time with this emergence into the mainstream of generative AI, which has really showcased the power of these technologies. But Juliette, I wanted to kind of challenge you on that a little bit and say, but is it not true that opaque systems can tend to be more computationally powerful than more transparent systems? And if so, how should companies manage that trade-off?
I don't necessarily think that that's the best way to look at it. I would challenge you to investigate a little bit further. I think that there are many organizations, and I'm thinking also in terms of research, academia. There are many private foundations that I'm involved with that are actually exploring the upper limits of what you're describing. And so I think that, we love to think that there are technical limitations to the various things that we think are important in terms of social justice, of making things equitable for all people through our technology. But I think that you would agree, I would hope, that ultimately, many of the biases that we have in our systems are essentially biases that we as humans have.
Yeah.
And so when I see positive examples, in this case, sadly, I can't talk about them because some of them come out of the Miele Institute, the Montreal Institute for Learning Algorithms, where I was speaking a couple of weeks ago. And so, there are certain things that they should be talking about as opposed to me. But I am really, really optimistic that we're going to be showcasing some new ways of doing things in the very near future. And so perhaps I'll get a chance to come on your show again and talk about it, Adrian.
Oh, there you go. There's a kind of like, flagrant kind of plug for a second appearance. So yeah, like I will take that, and we should kind of like discuss that further. Absolutely. But no, I think it's just something I wanted to ask that question because yes, you're right. Some of the bias is hardwired into algorithms and how we design it, but also in the data and what's kind of these models are exposed to, and particularly with things like OpenAI and how it's only ever trained on, I think to date, on the English language part of the internet. And for me, I always thought that was kind of quite strange because it sort of assumes that everything that can be known is expressed in English. And I thought, that's kind of like, well, that's doesn't really kind of like bear much kind of like scrutiny, kind of almost like that English is all knowledge is and all truth has been translated into English on the internet. And I'm like, well, for me, that just felt a bit odd.
No, I agree with you there. In general, the more languages you use on an AI system, the better it is.
Yeah.
And also to your point, there's so much oral history that is not on the internet at all.
Indeed.
That is fundamental to, our humanity. So yes, I agree with you, Adrian.
Absolutely. Perfect. So maybe the next thing I can come to is like Art and come to you on this one is that, because I wanted to highlight that the book is not just about laying out a case about this dilemma, but there's some practical stuff kind of in there. And Art, in the book, you outline 5 steps businesses can take to build on their kind of AI accountability. Given that the things that Juliette alluded to around biases that are inherent in the kind of algorithms and the systems that we've got to manage our way to try and minimize the impact of those to make sure that kind of the results are spread equally and equitably, through the use of this technology. So, Art, can you maybe highlight what you think those 5 steps businesses need to take in order to build the AI accountability?
Sure, and let me put that in context.
Mm-hmm.
These came out in part from our conversation with a friend named Anand Rao, who was the head of AI services at PwC, where I also used to work.
Mm-hmm.
And these have to do with the fact that even before generative AI, the practice of creating your own robots, bots, algorithms, this was spreading dramatically because people saw how useful it was.
Mm-hmm.
And it was spreading without guardrails. So there's a certain amount of, oh my gosh, what are people going to do?
Yeah.
How are they going, because we know AI takes people's existing biases and, whatever you don't like about human nature, AI is going to automate it and amplify it, just like it does for what we do like about human nature. So
mm-hmm.
how do we create a sense of self-awareness among people? And the 5 ways of doing this, one is education. Be aware of the consequences of what you do. How do you do that? Well, good judgment comes from experience. Experience comes from poor judgment. So you have to have education that allows people to experiment, see what the outcomes are without really doing harm. That's number 1. There has to be, number 2 is governance of data. So if you run a company, if I run a company, where are we collecting our data from? Data about facial recognition, for instance, systematically underrepresents people with darker skin and women.
Mm-hmm.
Are we taking precautions that the data covers the range of people that we're interested in? If it's a system about people, which a lot of systems are we aware of how representative the data we're gathering is to the problems we're trying to solve?
Mm-hmm.
Really relevant in medical issues, for instance.
Yeah.
Then there's, how accountable is the model? We go back to, sort of OpenAI. Is the model, can the model be queried if it does something unfair?
Mm-hmm.
Can the organization that created it be queried? Can the organization balance its kind of structural need for secrecy It's trade secrets, it's competitive advantage against the legitimate need that people have to find out what's really going on with the system. Mm-hmm. So that's number 3. And that's, each one of these, we could spend an hour on. Intellectual property is the 4th, who owns the material. That's where a lot of the lawsuits are going to come from, and generating new work out of old work. Is the new work respecting the same kind of IP ownership that the old work had? And then finally, can we develop some open source models, not just foundational models, but the practices, not the practices, but not just the foundational models, but the applications and the user interface designs? Are we all going to have different ways of queuing different systems with different language, or are we, as we did with the internet, settle on a few, kind of basic common approaches to things? And and will those approaches lead us to a more responsible way of using the technology?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a great kind of point. I like the idea about the accountability sort of thing, and it's funny. It made me think about how in the UK the Financial Conduct Authority just introduced this new slate of regulations around consumer duty and about fair treatment of customers, and it feels like, well, you have big financial services institutions that will be trying to use some of the technology, but they'll be measured on the consumer duty side of things. So it's almost a bit like they will get held accountable indirectly by customer outcomes, and so have to think about how they use things in order to deliver that. But there has to be fair and measured use of the technology in service of those customer duty outcomes. So I think that's kind of a fascinating indirect sort of kind of thing. So rather than trying to directly manage the technology, is you're actually kind of just managing the outcomes, and then people can figure out how they use the tools. And I also think on the open source side of thing, I think there's hope there as well, because on the back of the OpenAI and then Bard and Ernie and all sorts of other Sesame Street inspired kind of like new AI kind of like models coming out, that the open source community has produced real kind of dramatic improvements in some of the performances of some of these kind of the models of some of the big companies. So I think that's really kind of promising. But I think the big thing that's kind of like the specter around that's linked to all of that sort of stuff around ownership and accountability and everything else is about regulation and how that's kind of like starting to kind of grow in significance. I know the EU is on it, thinking about their legislation, and I don't know if that's going to be as effective, impactful as the GDPR was, but they're quick out of the blocks. So maybe Juliette, I mean, so we know that talk of regulation of AI has started. I mean, from your perspective, given that you're deep in this, is like, how do you see this playing out? And should we be waiting for regulation as companies or organizations, or should we be self-regulating and promoting responsible kind of AI kind of like use ourselves?
Well, you refer to GDPR, and while I was doing the interviews, both for my dissertation and then again, we redid interviews for the book, just about every tech company that I spoke to said that they were still playing catch up when it came to GDPR, and that they were in no way ready for the Artificial Intelligence Act coming out of the EU, whose fines are higher and include damages. So that is definitely something that makes me cautious about, big tech's ability to really be able to play by the rules that are set by the EU. Mm-hmm. Of course, big tech can afford to pay fines, but I'm not sure that smaller companies can. Mm. When it comes to self-regulation, there's so much competition between the big three that are all trying to become number one in the world when it comes to AI cloud. And so, the moment that OpenAI launched back in November, it put the pressure on Google Alphabet to do the same. And if you saw their first launch, they stumbled in February, had to launch again. Yep. So as much as companies want to be responsible. I do believe that they do want to be responsible, that they don't want to harm anybody. And of course, the larger the organization, the less they want to harm, because they have access to billions and billions of people, right? And ultimately, I don't know to what extent the AIA is going to have the kind of impact that it could. Obviously, it has to do with Europeans and European data being included in the data sets, in the systems. And if they're not, then likely these companies won't be affected. At the same time, I am a big believer in self-regulation. Self-regulation for all of us as humans, now that we have generative AI in the palm of our hands, I think it's up to us to be responsible about it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm shocked sometimes when I listen to some of my students who genuinely are asking a chatbot whether they should quit their job, whether they should leave their partner, whether they should move to the other side of the world. And they trust the response from the chatbot more than they do from their friends and family, saying that the system has more data on them and therefore knows them better.
Yeah. No comment on that point from me.
So thinking for all of us is key here.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing, the final, well, one of the other areas I wanted to dig into was the idea that the creation of content is this big thing. Generative AI is exploded, and it's not just text based, but it's kind of exploded into kind of image and moving image and kind of like music and all sorts of different kind of things. I think I just read a story just recently that there's some AI generated music artist called Nunu something, but I've just got a record deal with Warner's. I'm like going, how does that work? I don't know. Anyway, so the creation of content is a big part of the space I'm in, that customer engagement space. And in the book, you highlight sort of 3 things for teams to consider in developing systems that generate text and images and other content. And again, it's back to that kind of practical kind of nature. And I'm sorry if I'm going to come back to you, Art, as Mr. Practical kind of here. But I just thought maybe you can help kind of highlight those 3 things that people have to keep in mind when they're using these automated systems to generate these text and images and other content. What they should be keeping front of mind?
Well, it's business people, students, creators, any creative people.
Yeah.
We work with creative students in the courses we teach at NYU, and a lot of them are wondering, it's not just will I have a job, but will I have an audience?
Mm-hmm.
So the 3 things to keep in mind are, you're developing systems that now it's a lot easier. So they're probably going to be interactive systems in some ways. They're going to not just be directed at people and as a group, but they may be directed at individuals. So who are the actors
Mm-hmm.
who are going to be using what you develop, and how are they going to use it? Behavior is, what are the things people can do with what you produce? And then content is, Aristotle talked about the good, the beautiful, and the true. There's going to be a lot more beautiful and hopefully a lot of good. And then how much is going to be true, and how do we know?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I like to talk about, sort of who watches the watch robots? How do we know that there is actually going to be some validity, credibility, checkability
Mm-hmm.
in what an AI system says about someone else? And it's not just going to be government systems or corporate systems, that too, but we're going to see a lot of personally created systems that use data about the world in inventive ways to create insights, or perhaps to create misleading things. So, critical thinking, Juliette, you mentioned critical thinking a minute ago, and I think the nature of critical thinking is going to become rigorous and widespread in a way that it hasn't before, simply out of survival.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely right. And it circles back to that whole accountability sort of thing that you were talking about. But it's not accountability just at an organizational level. It's also accountability at an individual sort of level, and also the responsibility that comes with that around kind of what you are receiving, and also kind of and what that means, and kind of do you believe it, and is it checkable, and things, and also what you're putting out into the world as well. And
Adrian, I'll just add, having lists like this of the things to do, we're going to see AI systems doing a lot of that. Mm-hmm. So they're going to be, it's not going to be that practical anymore to have a list of three things, because I've got this list here and that list there and this list over here. And the judgment of knowing what to apply when may be more important than ever.
Oh, I think so. I mean, and in my space, I've always kind of thought that one of the things that people and organizations often get wrong, or rather don't get wrong, is they don't spend enough time thinking about, is thinking about what is an assessment, or rather a clear assessment and a clear and honest assessment of where you are currently, and then a vision of where you would like to get to, and what that means for all the different actors involved, whether they're customers or employees or stakeholders, investors, whoever it might be. And then you can then plot a strategy to go from A sort of to B. And I think that vision kind of piece, and what it means and what it's going to look like and feel like and how it's going to respond and act and all these different things, I don't think people spend enough time kind of like really envisioning what that could mean. And I think that's a real Achilles heel. And the thing is particularly pertinent with this, even though it might be hard because the pace of technological change is so fast, we can still envision a principle-led or a value-led future state. And then we can then work backwards from that to think about, well, what does that actually mean for different people and that are either using the tools or are recipients of the outputs of the tools?
I couldn't agree with you more, Adrian. In fact, I'd highly recommend for any organization that is looking to leverage, whether it's generative AI or any kind of AI system, really, that they include the population of interest in the development process before they even start coding, before they start creating the models, that they actually speak to the people and have them weigh in, have them imagine what is the best that can come out of this, but also what is the worst. Like, what are some of the harms that, me and sitting in front of my computer can't even begin to imagine, because I've never walked in those shoes. So bringing in those voices, not just in terms of, trying to imagine who they are, but actually talking to them, bringing that feedback in. The same thing as you're developing the system, keep testing it with the actual people. And then once you've deployed it, incorporate that feedback. It's just good practice.
Yeah. It reminds me of a thing that, that there's a practice that comes out of Amazon, whether you like them or not, doesn't really is immaterial. But there's some of the methods, the practices that come out of Amazon are really good. And one of the things that they do when they're developing new things, that Juliette, to your point, is rather than going, we have an idea and then we start to build something, and then we code, and then we get into that sort of build and test and things. And then at the end, you write the press release when you're releasing it. So what they do is they come up with the idea, and then right at the very beginning, they challenge themselves to write the press release right at the very beginning. And what the press release is there to describe how things would work, how people would use it, the sort of problems that they would face, kind of sort of the risks and the dangers and all the things to look out for. And it allows them to do that envisioning sort of like thing very kind of clearly by starting kind of like with an end kind of product. And it informs how they code and how they build and how they test and how they manage risk and all these different sort of things. And I think that's a really interesting, a really useful, a very powerful practice. It's powerful because we just see how big and kind of like influential kind of Amazon is. And that's just something that they do systematically. And I think there's wisdom in taking that sort of approach.
I also like the approach that X takes, X that is affiliated with Google and Alphabet.
I love the way that can I just say as an aside on that, I just love the way that they're following in Prince's footsteps. So it's like the artist formerly known as Prince. This is like the social media platform formerly known as Twitter.
Well, I wasn't talking about that particular platform. I was actually talking about the Moonshot Lab that is an of Google and Alphabet, which is also called X. In fact, it was called X for several years prior to Mr. Musk taking over the former Twitter. But at any rate, what we talk about X in the book, and specifically its leader, Astro Teller, and really the culture that is there, which is one of, first off, multidisciplinary work, which I think is really, really key. You've got incredible people working there that not only are specialists in one thing, but oftentimes specialists in multiple things, so they can look at things from very different angles simultaneously. And then the other thing that I think is really, really important is that they do these presentations for the group. And the group is encouraged to shoot down any issues that they might see. They do it at Pixar as well. They do it at several organizations that aren't necessarily focused on big tech or on AI. But again, it's just a good practice to be able to share with those that aren't necessarily really informed on your project, but are there to support you, are there to support the company, so that they shoot holes at things. And that feedback is either incorporated or not. It's optional. But just having that kind of feedback, I think, is really important. I've noticed while we've been teaching at NYU, we're encouraged to be very sensitive about our students and their frame of minds and so on and so forth. But at some point, you also have to give them feedback. You have to tell them when something can be better and how to get there, as opposed to just, passing everyone. And I think the same thing is required of what we produce.
Yeah, no, perfect. And I think, Juliette, I think you probably just jumped in and answered my kind of my next question before I even post it, which is brilliant. Because what I was going to ask you was that, do you have an example of a brand or organization that's leading in its approach to the use of AI? And I think there's many in the book, but I think there's a couple of kind of great examples of people to look up and to think about. It's not just about the data and the technology and the algorithms and stuff. Actually, it's about the organizational kind of fabric. To your point, Art, right at the very beginning, you talked about organizations and culture and all these different things. And ultimately, it's easy to change the data and the technology and things. The thing that's really kind of hard to change is ourselves, because that requires us to do things differently, develop new habits and kind of behaviors. And I think that's the thing that we don't necessarily pay as much attention to as we should do. But it's the thing that we should lean into to get, if we're going to get the most and the best out of this, the potential that this technology has. So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, there's a real UX angle to that too. One of the things that's probably going to happen is that people will start to have more control over their own user interfaces.
Yeah.
You will be able to determine how you receive Amazon. And you might have flavors that you choose from or design it from scratch. And that in turn means you're going to be thinking about what comes to you, how you react to it, and how it affects you over the long term. And people may do harm to themselves. If user interfaces can, hurt people psychologically, people may be tweaking it in ways that have effects they don't anticipate. So there's suddenly, or their children, and I mean, I don't know how much power or capability will be involved in this, but we do know that there will be experimentation, because there always is self-generated experimentation. That means a certain amount of awareness. That means a certain amount of training, and people will take that on.
Yeah. I think there's a lesson there from Spider-Man where was it Uncle Ben tells the young Spider-Man, is like, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yep. Now we're all Spider-Man or Spider-Woman. Spider people. I'm not
really sure I'd look good in the suit. I mean, personally.
You'd look terrific. I've seen some of the other images. And then there's always Gen AI to reconfigure you.
Well, there you go. Auto Photoshop me, to make me look kind of a perfect specimen. But anyway, to both of you, I mean, Juliette's kind of art, I mean, I think it's a great book. I really enjoyed kind of digging around in it. I mean, is there anything, before we kind of ask you some general kind of questions, is there anything else that you'd like to add or highlight that we've kind of missed out? Juliette, anything you want to flag?
I honestly think you've done a fantastic job of, and I know how busy you are. The fact that you actually read the book is thank you. That's a huge thank you. Really appreciate it. One of the questions that was asked to me as we were laying the book to rest for the third time, because of course, as soon as generative AI came out, we had to rewrite, 20-30% of the book. But somebody pointed out to me that the book had to have meaning.
Mm-hmm.
That it wasn't just about the tech, and it wasn't just about business, and it wasn't just about users of the technology, that it had to have meaning. And that's why at the beginning of the book, I shared the story of a family member who, during the pandemic, was isolated. And like many, many, many people all over the world, she no longer had access to her family. Medical staff would come in wearing masks where she didn't recognize anyone, and she was really lost, didn't have access to her phone, kept being moved from ward to ward because of COVID. And so I lost my great aunt. I never saw her again. And I started imagining what would have happened if AI had been, taking care of her at that moment. Would it have been better? And a friend of mine, Eric Johansson, pointed out that AI actually does some things far better than we do. And I think that we are just beginning to learn what those things are. So I'm optimistic. At the same time, I think the reason that I'm optimistic is because I've had the opportunity to speak with people like Yoshio Bengio, one of the grandfathers of artificial intelligence, who really believes that fundamentally, we need more oversight, not just as individuals, not just as countries, but oversight on a global level. And it seems like, things are in motion in that direction. So I'm really optimistic about the future.
Awesome. Art, anything to add?
Yeah, I come from a background of organizational learning. And one of the tenets is you don't really learn about a complex system until you get into it. Mm-hmm. And really study it. And, we do an advisory practice, and that's one of the reasons why. We know that in order to keep up with the field, there is a lot of kind of on-the-job learning that has to be done by leaders, by employees. I've been taking a course on prompt engineering for this reason, just to be hands-on. And I think there's going to be a lot more of that. AI is like a forcing function. It forces us to become more aware of what we do, what our organizations do, what the world does at large in those interrelationships. And we're going to see a lot more conversations like this one, I think.
Awesome. Now, if we can zoom out a little bit, and I wanted to draw on your experience, and given the focus of this podcast and the work that I do, is to ask you both to weigh in on what you think would be your best advice to someone listening into this that wants to improve their customer, user, employee experience, just general the experience that they deliver overall. So I'll come back to you, Art, quickly, because I know we talked to this before the call. You had a particular thing that you wanted to weigh in on user experience. So maybe you can tell me about what was on your mind.
Well, we've already covered a lot of it with, control over the user experience for the things that get handed to you. With great power comes great responsibility. So don't just learn as you go, but talk to other people who are learning as they go and make it deliberate. If it's the kind of thing where you're staying up all night to talk about something, talk about this and what's going to happen as you exercise this new power, because it's going to matter.
Awesome. Juliette?
Well, let's talk about control for a minute. I think that most of us, through our digital devices, feel more in control than ever. We know exactly what path to take and how long it's going to take to get somewhere, thanks to our maps. We supposedly know who to date. We know exactly where we're going to be moving to, what our next job is going to be, thanks to the control that we exercise with our devices. But what we've really found by doing the research around this book is that it's all an illusion. We have the illusion of control. In fact, we have less choices. When you only have one buy button or one deactivate button, that's not very much of a choice. So we had the pleasure of speaking with Columbia professor Sheena Iyengar about what this thing is. What is this control? Apparently it is fundamental to our humanity. It's part of who we are. We have this need for control. And as a result, we become addicted to anything that gives us the sense that we do have control. What I'd like to say is that what she taught us, and what we're trying to also show by the book, is that when we don't put deep thought into making decisions, when we don't do a cost-benefit analysis, when we just blindly choose because the button is bigger or a brighter color, that is not actually control. It's the illusion of control. So I challenge all of us to pick the things that we really care about and to really do these cost-benefit analysis, not just for the short term, but for the medium term and for the longer term, because you might get very different answers along the way.
Perfect. I love the reference to Sheena Iyengar because I know her work, and particularly around the paradox of choice and things. And I think some of that work is brilliant because, as human beings, it's easier to add things when we end up with this kind of like, we tell ourselves, we like choice, but actually choice doesn't really help us. And she shared that with her kind of with her work. And so I think I love the reference that you've kind of gone and talked to her, and it's had an impact on the book. So before we go, two kind of like slightly sidebar questions. First one is to do with the two books that I wrote sort of relatively recently. One's called Punk CX, one's called Punk XL. So the first question I wanted to ask you is sort of what one word would you use to describe a more punk approach to sort of customer experience? Now, I warn you, I'm just checking my notes here. I have collected 191 different words and phrases over the course of the last few years. So as left field as you like, to pick out kind of like a word or a phrase is more likely to get you on the list, because I'm going to stop at 200 and then fix it because I've been going at it for a long time. I think 200 feels like a good number. So, Juliette, right. I will come to you first.
Okay, that's my answer. RX.
RX.
The right to experience.
Oh.
The right to a good experience. RX.
I love that. There's so much in that. That's one of the things, Art, we could talk a lot about that, what that means.
Yeah.
But what about top that one, Art?
Friction. Creative friction.
Actually, you know what? I thought friction would be on there, but friction is not on there, surprisingly enough. And so you're 2 for 2.
Yes.
And the second one is the follow-up book to Punk CX was this book called Punk XL, and XL stands for Experience Leadership. And because what it occurred to me was that it's no longer sufficient to talk about customer experience in isolation. We have to your point earlier, we live and we operate within complex systems, and therefore customer, employee, stakeholder, it's all a big connected thing. And so it also struck me that we talk about technological leadership, we talk about brand leadership, we talk about market leadership, but we don't talk about experience leadership. And that's quite odd, given that customer experience is one of the things that many companies talk about. This is a competitive differentiator. And so I wants to ask you both, what company or brand do you think is an experienced leader and why? Juliette?
You are definitely talking to, between the two of us, the one that shops the least. Let's see. Who does it right?
Who's setting the bar? You might also kind of say, I should point out, if you go, I don't think anybody's getting it right now. And there's kind of like work to be done.
So one of the best experiences I ever had, and this has nothing to do with AI, was on Virgin Atlantic.
Okay.
I don't know to what extent they're still doing this, because this was when they were launching their flight from New York to Gatwick and Toronto to Gatwick. So this was a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
I remember sitting at a bar on the plane, and I remember having offers to get my feet and shoulders rubbed on the flight. Now, these are not things that someone like me would ever expect in any context, but these were perks that I never would have imagined. And yes, they were quite extraordinary.
Awesome. Great example. Art, Anybody that stands out for you?
A lot of people stand out for me, and I use the word people explicitly. Chains attempt to do this, but the experiences that stay in mind are small places where the individual proprietor or somebody who has some power in the company, in the restaurant, in the bar, in the store, in the business to business experience, somebody has a connection and just kind of likes people. Okay. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that AI designs experience, or that experience is designed on a commercial basis, we have to generate transactions that genuinely like people or appear as if they do. And awesome. That's going to be pretty challenging. And if they make the challenge work, then that's challenging in a different way.
Yeah. And thank you for that. So one final thing before we go, because I've decided a little while ago that I want to try and end these interviews on a good news story, because I find myself getting up every morning, getting with my cup of coffee and doom scrolling through the news, looking for kind of some highlights of kind of like positive news. So I thought we could incorporate that into the podcast. And I wanted to ask you, what's the most interesting, positive, or exciting thing that you've seen in the last week? Art, I'll come to you first.
We just did our scenario class. Juliette and I co-teach a class on future scenarios, and we did the future of AI. And we did another session, and an idea keeps sticking with me, which is that, so this idea is really interesting to me, which is people are going to adjust their behavior to fit into an AI world. So there will be clothing made with signals to self-driving cars. There will be glasses that interpret, that send flashes to automated systems, to, sensors on our computers. The dialogue between person and machine is just beginning, and we haven't seen the human adaptation side of it yet. That's just, it's not a thing, but it's an idea that is very intriguing to me.
Awesome. Thank you. And Juliette?
So we were just in Toronto to do our book launch, and I had the pleasure of staying with a friend that I knew way back in my television days. Originally, she was Canada's first female videographer. Now she's 70. And she was telling me about ChatGPT. She was essentially learning on her own how to become a prompt engineer. And she lives alone and, sadly is recently divorced. And so started using generative AI kind of as a companion, but slowly but surely started to hone her prompts, and has started creating again. So to me, it kind of opened my eyes to the positive impact that these tools can have on an aging population, an aging lonely population.
Perfect. What a wonderful story. Yeah, I mean, and it's by the emergence of generative AI is definitely kind of like, it's into the mainstream. It's sort of ignited many people's imagination of what's kind of possible, but then hopefully through that, the ignition of their imagination, like you highlight in the book, it will raise consciousness about what is good and fair and equitable kind of practice and use of these kind of these tools and technology. So I just want to say, Juliette, Art, thank you for spending some time with me today. Thank you for, congratulations on the book. And it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. So thank you so much.
Oh, Adrian, it was a treat. Thank you. And again, we're happy to come anytime, support you.
Thanks, Adrian.
Wow, what a great interview. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. Find out more about me and the work that I do at adrianswinscoe.com. Do leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you have any comments, feedback, or questions about the podcast, then feel free to send me a message to podcast@adrianswinscoe.com. And do tune in again. Thanks very much.